the digital Bible. And if you can access the website, bible.tjc.org, we can also practice how to use tools. Now, why do we even need to use tools? For example, if you want to look up a word, why do you even want to bother to look up a word? Does anyone want to share? Right, exactly. Because the Bible was not written in English or Chinese. If the Bible was written in English and Chinese, I think we can skip a lot of the tools. But because it's written in a second language, and also not only a foreign language, but an ancient language. In fact, the Bible were written in primarily two ancient languages. And that is the primary reason it's very helpful to look things up and just not assume that what it says in English is what the author actually meant. So there's the saying, lost in translation. Because in the process of translating from language to another language, it's very likely that some meaning is lost because there's no perfect correspondence between words, between languages. There's always a difference. So this afternoon, I shared about God testing Abraham, right? In Chinese, 耶和华以勒is translating the sound of that word. And I think KJV might translate it as Jireh, right? Jehovah Jireh. That's translating the sound. Just like in English, when you say, what's a good example? One ton, right? When you say 1 ton, what is 1 ton? 1 ton is translating the transliteration. It's replicating the sound of Chinese, but it has no meaning, right? It's just 1 ton is 1 ton. But in Chinese, 1 ton has a meaning. So Jehovah Jireh is translating the sound. But some English Bibles, like the NKJV, would say the Lord will provide, right? Provide is supposedly the meaning of that word. But that word it's not limited to mean provide. What is the other meaning? Assuming you stay awake during the sermon. See, right? That word, Yareh in Hebrew is see. Right? But because when the translators translate that word, they have to choose. They cannot say provide /see/ give you all the options. They can only pick what they think is the best translation. So when you're reading the Bible, you're reading an interpretation already. You didn't know that, right? You think, oh, I'm reading the Bible. This is, the meaning of God's word. No, you're reading somebody's interpretation. Okay, that's why tools are helpful for looking things up. Okay, so we're going to start by identifying keywords, but we're going to use Genesis chapter 28 as our example. Genesis 28, let's start from verse 10. We're going to go around and read. Each person will read one verse at a time, as if we normally do. Yes. Oh, it timed out. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, if it happens again, you can just yell at me and let me know. Okay. Well, yeah, we don't have to wait for this, but let's turn to our own Bibles, Genesis 28, and we're going to start reading from verse 10. So we'll read, each person will read as we normally do, and then we'll practice slowing down. Now, starting from our brothers here, can you please read one verse at a time, verse 10? Please continue. Should we try cable? Or maybe you can project the bible.tjc.org for me if this doesn't work. Bible.tjc.org. It's connected. Thank you. Okay, thank you. That's the normal pace we read the Bible, right? And sometimes perhaps even faster when you're tired and ready to go to bed. You may read faster. And now, if we just close the Bible, normally we would think, I already know the story, right? I've attended so many RE classes, Heavenly Ladder, in the Dream, you know. I even know what the application is. We need to draw close to God, right? And so we have all these assumptions because we've heard so many sermons, RE classes, and so forth. So we think we already know. No need to go back and read again. We already know the story. And in fact, you know, we don't even need to look at the Bible and we can retell the story, right? That's a common assumption, especially with a familiar passage like this one. And it's easy to jump to application right away. And the purpose of studying the Bible is ultimately to apply it to our lives. Otherwise, there's no point because studying the Bible is not just studying literature, because we believe that God's word is in the Bible. So our goal is to hear and understand what God is trying to tell us, and then learn to live it out in our lives. So every Bible study should have life application as its final goal. But before you get to life application, you need to make sure that your interpretation is correct. If interpretation is correct, very likely your application, if the interpretation is incorrect, very likely your application is not correct either. I heard a preacher said once a boy came back home from church after attending RE class. The parents asked, "What did you learn today in RE class?" And the boy said, "We learned the story of David killing Goliath." And then the parents asked, "So how do we apply it to our lives?" And he said, "We shouldn't throw stones at people." That's the life application the boy got. Right? Don't throw stones at people. Based on the story of the David and Goliath. Now, yes, we shouldn't throw rocks at our friends. That's an important life application. But that's not the correct application based on the story of David and Goliath, right? So even though it sounds ridiculous, we don't think we would do that. But sometimes we make similar mistakes. We are so quick to conclude, oh, this is what this passage must mean, and this is what is teaching me. And we skip all the steps before we arrive at the application. And there's a risk when you do that, because you may be misunderstanding what it's actually saying, and then misapplying what it's saying. Okay, so let's come back to identifying keywords. One way to identify keywords is to ask questions, and we're gonna try it now. So let's go back to the story, and now pay closer attention to the story. Let's try asking ourselves, even before you lead a Bible study, try to ask yourself questions so you can learn more about the passage. So let us open up and try, okay? What are some of the questions that come to mind and you want to find out more about this story? So let's please try. Anybody. There's no right or wrong questions. Based on verses 10 to 22. Questions can be very simple. Don't have to be hard questions. Questions you want to find answers to. Yes? Okay. Okay, good. Why did God appear to Jacob at this juncture? And did God ever appear to Jacob before this story? Let's, other people, please. Okay, how does John 1:51 relate to this passage? Maybe a preliminary question to that is, because you're probably thinking of the angels of God ascending and descending, right? So because of that, you are curious whether there's a connection between the two. So maybe a preliminary question could be, are there other places where we see a ladder reaching to heaven in the Bible? Okay. Other questions? Anything that makes you curious? Okay, which is verse 12, right? The angels of God were ascending and descending on it. What's the significance? What were they doing? Any other questions? Oh, sorry, I missed you. Yep. Yep. Right. Why rise early in the morning? Why take the stone? Why set it up as a pillar? And why pour oil on top of it? Yes. So as you ask these questions, you can already write down, if you have a pen, you can write it down or type it on your device. Some keywords, such as in this case, pillar, right? Pillar. And then just now there was a question about the angels ascending and descending, as well as the ladder, right? These are all words that you can study further. And by asking questions, these words come to the fore, meaning you start to notice that there are some important words. Any other questions? Yes? Okay. Do people change names of places in the Bible, right? I assume. Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What? Sorry, I missed the last question. What would other people name this place? Oh, I see. You mean both before or after the event? Oh, can you just rename some place as you see fit? Okay, yeah, that's good. Again, when you're asking questions, you may not have the answer. In fact, you probably don't have the answer. That's why you ask questions. You're curious, right? You're curious. And you're not asking these questions because you're thinking, okay, what should I ask this group, Bible study group? That's thinking too far ahead. Even before you prepare the Bible study, you gotta ask yourselves questions, right? You have to be curious. If you're not even curious, then it's hard for you to be a Bible study leader or to get much out of the passage. Okay. How about some very basic questions, like the first verse? Jacob went out from Beersheba and went toward Haran. Right? You can write down Beersheba and Haran. Where are these places? Where are these places? And then, why was he going out? Why was he going out from Beersheba toward Haran? That's a very simple question, but it's helpful. It's helpful in understanding the passage. Okay. Yeah. And another question that you can ask, for example, is, right, 17, Jacob's reaction, or maybe starting from verse 16. He was surprised that the Lord is in this place. Why is he surprised? And 17, why was he afraid? These are questions you can ask, even though you don't know the answer yet. All right. Again, as you ask questions, write down words that you can look up, such as afraid. Right. Okay. So one way to identify keywords is to ask the 5 W's and 1 H. Who, what, where, when, why, and then how, right? And questions like that. And don't worry if the questions are basic, because this is just for yourself, right? To help yourself slow down. Another common common way to identify keywords is repetition. Repetition. If a word appears repeatedly, except things like the definite article, the, or God, these usually appear very often, right? But we're talking about in the story, maybe there is a word or several words that appear quite frequently, that whereas in other passages they don't. Now, let's try in this passage. Did you notice any keyword that repeated? Pillar, yes, in some way, yes. Heaven, let's see, the heaven appears repeatedly two times, yeah. Okay. Heaven can be included. Stone, yes. House of God, yes, and also the name Bethel, they're related. Descendants, let me check. So verse 14 and verse 13, okay, good. And yeah, this also actually happens even before verse 10. When Isaac blessed Jacob before he left, he also mentioned descendants. Yeah, so those are good observations. Okay. Is there special significance with I in this passage as opposed to other passages? Oh, I see. Meaning I as God, right? Referring to God. I see. Okay. Yeah. At this point, again, identifying keywords, there's no right and wrong. So I'm not trying to screen your keywords. I'm just wondering what you're thinking. Okay. Any other keywords? This is when you really have to slow down. If you skim through this, you're not going to catch it for sure, because most of us don't have super brains. Most of us just read and forget right away. That's normal. That's why you have to go back and slow down. There's a word that appears at least 4 times. Place, good. A place is very, very important in this passage. Now you may think, oh, what's the big deal about place, right? I already know this is such a common word. But in this passage, it's not a common word. It's a key word, as we will see shortly. Okay, so that's a way. That's a practice by recognizing repetitions. Repeating words are often repeated intentionally by the Bible, by the author. And if you miss it, you miss something very important, and you miss an important message, which in this case, in terms of place, is important to the story, and we'll come back to that. All right. Now, in addition to repeating words, there are other words you can also look up or write down. to do more study on. Um, let me switch over to Irima. Verse 11 says, on reaching a certain place. Now, the word reaching seems very ordinary, but in the story of Isaac, this word appears in chapter 28 as well as in chapter 32. But this requires that you know the larger life of Jacob's story. And there are two important turning points for Jacob in his life. The first turning point, or the first, important, significant event is right here, when he left home to go to Haran. And then the second significant event is when he came back from Haran. And in both of these stories, this word appears, reach, and you can also look it up yourself. This word can be translated as meet or chance upon. In other words, it wasn't planned. It wasn't planned. He met this place. And then, this is chapter 28. And then later in chapter 32, who met Jacob? Okay, since we're looking at this tool, we can just go ahead and click on it to open this. So now we're using the Hebrew word to search for its occurrences, right? And then when you click on it, you see that this word appears in chapter 28, verse 11. This is the first time this word is used in Jacob's life. And then the second time which is the final time in Jacob's life, is in chapter 32, verse 1. The angels of God met him. Okay. So in the first significant event, he met this place. And in the second significant event, the angels met him. And this meet can, like I said, be unplanned, but it can also be planned. So in the first event, Jacob did not plan to come to this place. You can say he chanced upon this place, and then later the angels intentionally met him. Okay. So why did I mention this? Oh yeah. So another way to identify keywords is to see if there are any words that are used in a peculiar way, unusual way. But if you just read English, it's difficult. Yeah, I don't expect you to know this because in English it sounds very normal, right? This word reaching this place sounds like a very average, very normal word. And another example of a peculiar word I mentioned. Why was Jacob afraid? Right? And if you check this word, afraid, H3372, this is the same word as later in the same verse. How awesome is this place? So these are actually two words. But guess what? The translators, out of the goodness of their heart, decide to interpret for you. The first time, they choose afraid. Let me look at NKJV. How do they translate this? Right. The first time, they translate it as afraid. Second time they translate it as awesome. Yeah, thanks to their hard work. But because they interpreted this for you, you do not know, right? How many people knew that it's the same word? Unless you look it up, right? Unless you look it up, you would not know. Okay, how about the first time? Same. Okay, afraid and dreadful, still two different translations, right? Closer, okay. Yeah, so you're actually relying on somebody else's interpretation. You think, oh, I'm reading the scriptures. Every word is very, is very precious, but you're actually reading somebody else's commentary or interpretation. That's why we look up words, right? So here in this verse, that word is important. Afraid and awesome are actually is the same word in Hebrew. So you could try translate it as he was fearful. He was fearful and said, how fearful is this place? Right? If you translate it like that, then readers will immediately catch the connection. Yeah, so you can look for words that stand out, words that are unusual. Yeah, that's another way to identify keywords. Okay, so those are several ways to identify keywords I suggested. There are others, but you can use your own methods to come up with keywords. But again, the intention here is to slow down. Slow down. You cannot do this if you're reading fast. So we talked about asking questions as a way of finding keywords. And questions are also good because they will make you come back to look for answers in the passage. Another way to help you slow down, right? And then we talked about repetition, and we talked about peculiar words. Yeah, I think that's good enough for now. Now, let's talk about the word place. Okay. So if you highlight this word, a place, starting from verse 11. In eRima, when you tap on or click on a word to highlight it, the same word will be highlighted throughout the chapter. So it will tell you where else this word appears in the same chapter. And you'll realize that it appears at least 4 times. And why do I say at least, not exactly 4? Because I will show you. Because again, thanks to the translators, they sometimes omit words. And in this case, it happens to be a keyword that is being omitted. Okay, so one way to see it quickly is to tap on a word to see where else it might appear. And sometimes same word is translated differently in different places. So unless you do this, you would not know. You would not know it's actually the same word. Like for example, afraid and awesome or dreadful, right? You would not know they're the same word until you do this, tap on it, or check the Strong's number. I hope people know what the Strong's number is. Yeah? Okay, strong numbers are just unique identifiers. So every Hebrew word and Greek word in the Bible has been assigned a unique ID. So in the case of, okay, for example, place, this Hebrew word is already assigned a unique ID, H4725. So whenever you see H4725, you can be sure that in Hebrew is the same word. So it's an identifier, a Strong's number. And the person who invented this is called James Strong. That's why it's called Strong's number. All right. Now, there's another tool that you can use to check repetition, and that's in the cross-references tab. So let's switch over to cross-references. If you have a device, you can follow along. And under the cross-references tab, there is a sub-tab called word frequency. Let's take a look. So this word frequency sub-tab tells you, it lists all the Hebrew words in this passage, Hebrew or Greek words in this passage, and it ranks each word by how many times it appears in this passage, with the most frequent word appearing at the top. And you can do some fancy filters, right? For example, if I don't want a definite article, I can uncheck it. If I only want to see nouns and verbs, you can do filter. But that's a little more advanced. You can play with it on your own. But for now, we don't need to play with it. You can just watch my demonstration. And then here in this field, you can change the range. By default, it gives you the entire chapter, the words in that entire chapter. But since we're looking at Genesis, why did it give me John? Genesis 28, 10 to, what's the last verse? 22? Okay. Then you can enter 10 to 22. Hit return, and it gives you words in the order of their frequency. The first word, which appears the most often, 7 times, is God. Not very surprising, right? Because God is everywhere in the Bible. So if you see God as appearing frequently, there's probably not, it probably doesn't mean a lot necessarily. But look at the second word that appears the most often in this passage is place. And even though it seems to be an ordinary word, it's quite uncommon for this word to appear so many times in a passage. And we're going to expand this to see exactly where this word appears. So remember I said if you just tap on the highlight, right, it shows 4 times, right? But actually this word is used 6 times. 6 times in the passage, not just 4 times. And so in verse 11, on reaching a certain place, this is first occurrence, he spent the night there because the sun had set. And taking one of the stones from that place, second time, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep. You may think, why highlight to sleep? It's because the translators did not translate lay down in that place to sleep. They skipped in that place. So if you really want to check the Hebrew words in that verse, you can look at the right pane, the words pane, and you'll see 4725 appears here, and then 4725 appears here, and 4725 appears here. But thanks to the translators, they only translated twice here in verse 11. Okay, so the last sentence should be lay down in that place to sleep. Now, when the translators translated this verse, they probably thought, it's so redundant. What keeps saying this place so many times? Just skip it. So they just translated it as lay down to sleep. Now, did NKJV people, translators, do the same? Let's take a look. Yeah, NKJV is quite literal. So if you look at NKJV, It does translate it 3 times, does it not? Right. He came to a certain place, and then he took one of the stones of that place, and then he lay down in that place to sleep. So NKJV in this instance is quite faithful to the Hebrew. And speaking of which, it's also helpful if you haven't learned the original languages. It's helpful to compare translations. But honestly, I think most people will miss this kind of details, right? Most of us, unless you are really, really, really looking at every word and comparing, which takes a lot of time. And yeah, if you're lazy, it's most likely you will not do this kind of work. But the time is well spent. You will discover things you never realized before, you never noticed before. Okay, now since we're talking about this keyword, let's study it. Okay, study it. So going back to our 6 occurrences. The fourth time is in verse 16. Surely the Lord is in this place. In verse 17, how awesome is this place? And then 19, he called the place Bethel. Keep repeating the place. Now the question is why? What's the significance of the word place? Now, why did he not just mention the name of that place? Did that place have a name? Did that place have a name? House of God? That's after the dream. Before the dream, was there a name? Right, Luz, right? Verse 19. Verse 19. So why in verse 11 the Bible doesn't say, on reaching Luz, he spent the night there because the sun has set? Why not? Right? Doesn't it make you curious? Maybe you're not curious, but I am. Right? Why not just say he came to Luz? So it's as if the author is intentionally not telling you the name. Now, so that's observation, right? Observation. But then, as to why you cannot get the author back in time, go back to the future and tell us, hey, why didn't you say on reaching Luz? Why did you say on reaching that place? You cannot do that, right? Because the author is not around. You can ask him when you go to heaven, but now you have to make an educated guess. Why? Why, right? So that's interpretation. So when it comes to interpretation, you may not always know for sure what the correct answer is. But once you start reading slowly and then start putting the pieces together, you will get a clearer and clearer picture, and then your confidence level will increase to interpret why the author did that. So my conclusion from my own study is that the name of the place, the former name of the place, is not important. It's not important in this story. So it came at the very end, verse 19, near the very end, verse 19. The author is like, oh, by the way, this place was called Luz, but now it has a new name. So when Jacob had that dream, or when he reached that place, the name of that place was not important. The author didn't think that we need to know the name of that place. Now, I don't know how many of you know the Chinese hymn of 234, Nearer My God to Thee, right? Is that 234? That hymn in Chinese talks about, mentions this story of Jacob's dream. And there's a phrase in that hymn, 野地枕石而眠, right? He took a stone as pillar in the wild to sleep. So the assumption is that Jacob was in the wild, out in the wild. Was Jacob in the wild? No, he was in the city of Luz. But people just assume, oh, Jacob, so pitiful, 很可怜, right? No place to go. He must be in the wild. That's an assumption. And why do you have the assumption? Because you don't read carefully. You probably missed the detail in verse 19, right? And because the author intentionally doesn't tell us the name, it's easy to make that false assumption that Jacob was sleeping out in the wild, away from any civilization. Right? That's why people wrote that hymn with that assumption. It's not in English. I already checked, so don't worry. But this is not in the wild. This was a city. This was already a city called Luz. Okay. Now, so the author just calls this a certain place. And then if we connect this to what I said earlier, reaching can mean chance upon, meaning he met this place unplanned. But then this place, that seemed to be just an ordinary place, turned out to be a special place. This special place became where God revealed himself to Jacob. And then I think it was Brother John who asked the question, right? Or Brother Wayne who asked the question, did God appear to Jacob before this? And then you could do your study, right? All this takes time. All this takes time. You can't do this in 5 minutes. Then you have to go back and look at why is this theophany or appearance of God so important here? Because prior to this, there is no mention, right, of God's revelation, direct revelation to Jacob. So his life was very different from the life of Abraham when God called him to leave Haran. But Jacob grew up and never, or at least the Bible did not record any encounter, personal, direct encounter with God prior to this event. So Jacob did not expect at all that in this place he would meet God, because it was just a place, a certain place. Right? Nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary. And then, so later verse 16, surely the Lord is in this place. That's part of the wonder, part of the surprise. This is just a normal place. How come the Lord is actually here? And I was unaware of it. Why was he unaware of it? Because it just seemed like an ordinary place. He did not think, oh, tonight I'm going to have a special dream and God's going to appear to me. No, he had no idea that what was coming. And then verse 17, how awesome is this place? This is none other. This place, well, I added the word place, but this is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. That's what contributes to the surprise. It's a huge contrast between an ordinary place that he slept and God being in this very place, and how awesome this place is. And this place is the house of God and the gate of heaven. That's why by just looking up and carefully checking the occurrence of the word place in the Bible, we can already get so much. And isn't this how we come to know God for many of us? Jesus said, you did not choose me, I chose you. So for many of us, we happen to meet God unplanned. we did not expect to be part of the True Jesus Church. Right? Somebody invited us, or through some God's guidance, we came to know God. We did not plan any of this. And some of us are like Jacob, right? In our younger days, yes, we know that there's a God. Right? He heard from his father, from his grandfather about God, but he never really directly experienced God. But then, when we go through certain life events, that's when we touch God. We experience God so directly, in such a personal way, that we recognize, wow, God, you're here. God, you have been in my life all along. In fact, God was in Jacob's life all along, but Jacob did not know because he did not experience. Right? So for those of us who grew up in church, we could also go through that experience too. In the past, we only hear from our parents and our church members about God, but now we experience God, and this experience is not planned. You cannot say, "Oh, I plan to experience God tomorrow." It doesn't work that way. When God lets you experience you experience Him, and this is how we can relate to the life of Jacob, right? So for me, when I prepared this Bible study for my sermon, that's how I moved from observation, looking at details, to interpretation and to application. Like I said, interpretation doesn't have to be, you may not know for 100% for sure that your interpretation is correct, but when you put together all the other pieces, then you can be pretty sure. Like I said, I share with you why I think Jacob was surprised, because to him it was just an ordinary place. That's the reason he was surprised. So that's how I draw life application from it. But you need to do it step by step. You can't jump to conclusion right away. And then I just showed you the word frequency tool, right? This is kind of like a lazy way to find most frequent words in that passage. I would suggest that you try to do it by carefully reading first, instead of going straight to this tool. But I have to admit, sometimes when I'm lazy or I'm in a hurry, then I would use this tool to check. So just in case you need to do that, the tool is there. And like I said, some occurrences, some frequently occurring words may not necessarily be that important in that passage. And yeah, so you don't necessarily have to study every single word in this passage. Okay, so that's a word study. Okay, I think I will just use maybe 10 more minutes. I'd like to talk a little bit about context. Paying attention to context is important. And again, this also forces you to slow down, because you need to read. What is context? Context is what goes before the passage and what comes after the passage. Or if you're reading a verse, one single verse, the context is the immediately preceding verse and the immediately following verse. That's called immediate context. And you can slowly expand your context into broader context. So just now, I talked about the two times the word meat appears, right? First time in Genesis 28, second time in Genesis 32. That's broader context. Now, is there another repetition besides the word meat in chapter 28 and chapter 32? Anybody would like to try? There's another word that appears in both places, another key word. that occurs in chapter 28 as well as chapter 32. But this is a more challenging question because it's a broader context. You need to really read all the chapters to figure this out. I'll give you the answer. The son. So in chapter 28, verse 11. On reaching a certain place, he spent the night there because the sun had set. You may think, what a useless detail. What a useless detail, right? Of course, the sun already set, right? Why add that detail? But then if you go to chapter 32, maybe we should use NKJV. Okay, that's good. Let's look at verse 31. You can read whatever version you're looking at. Here, I'm reading from this BSB. The sun rose above him as he passed by Penuel, and he was limping because of his hip. So in chapter 28, the sun set. Chapter 32, the sun rose. You may think, oh, it's just a coincidence. But I don't think the Bible has a lot of coincidences. A lot of times, details are intentional. And to me, this involves some interpretation, of course. But to me, the sun set at the beginning of the journey to Haran for Jacob, and the sun rising when he comes back to meet his brother is significant. The mention of the sun. Sunsets, it can be symbolic of the days ahead were getting dark, figuratively speaking. Because what happened in Haran, he met somebody who was more tricky than him, his uncle. He had a hard time. His uncle really worked him hard. And yeah, he went through a lot when he was in Haran. It wasn't easy. He didn't have a good time. It wasn't easy. Those were not easy days. But God was training him. And then the final challenge was when he came back to face his brother, and he had to wrestle with that man in the middle of the night. And then after he became crippled, the Bible says the sun rose on Jacob, which is symbolic or figurative of a turning chapter. A page has turned in Jacob's life. Right? So this is an example of context, looking at the larger context. But you can also look at smaller contexts. Larger contexts are harder. Let's go back to chapter 28, verse 10. As I said, you can ask yourself, why did Jacob leave Beersheba and set out for Haran? And where are these two places? Why did he go to Haran? So to answer the question why Jacob had to leave, then you read the story that happened before this passage, which is he took the birthright and the blessings from his brother. You have to go back to read that. And his brother wanted to kill him. And his parents decided to send him away. But why Haran? Right? Then you have to look it up too. Where is Haran? Why Haran? Anyone? Home? Home to who? Whose home? Yes, Abraham's home, and also more immediate is his mother's home, right? Because remember, the old servant went all the way back to Abraham's hometown to find somebody to bring back, and they found Rebecca, right? This is Haran, and another name of the hometown is Padam Aram. Anyway, don't worry about it. And then you can look up, right, using tools like the facts to see the places mentioned in verse 10. So I'm looking at the facts tab, and it's a sub-tab called places. And I can tap on this globe icon. For some reason, every time I demo this, it doesn't cooperate. Oh, it doesn't show on my screen, but it shows over there. Anyway, then you can see how far Beersheba to Haran is. And you can also Google and find out the distance. It takes a person walking, average walking pace, 20 days to go from Beersheba to Haran. So it's a very, very long journey. Okay, but then this entire long journey is all covered in one verse. Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. Just one verse. And then the rest of the verse, from verse 11 to verse 22, talks about what happens in that one place, which means the author thinks that this place is the most important part, is most important part of the journey. Okay, so that's another thing you can observe. Yeah, but I wanted to talk about context. Context meaning you need to look at the events prior as well as sometimes events after. Now, just very quickly, time is up. Why pillar? And why pour oil on top? Then you can also do a word study of pillar. Pillar, I'll give you the quick answer. Pillar in Hebrew is literally the thing that stands. It's the noun form of stand. So if you look carefully at the story, right, the ladder that reaches to heaven stood, right? And then who was standing on top? God. God was standing on top. And then pillar, in English, you don't see the connection between pillar and stand, but in Hebrew, it's very clear. Hebrew is the thing that stands. So why did he set up a pillar? To represent what he saw in the vision, in the dream, the thing that stood. And why pour oil on top? On top, if you check the word, means on the head. What was on the head of the ladder? God. So pouring oil on the head of the pillar represents God standing on top of the pillar. So it's a visual representation and a memorial of that vision of the ladder. Okay, that's a very quick answer. No time to go into details to do demo, but that's also important to the story. All right, so we will conclude, and hopefully this, again, if you forget everything I said, just remember to slow down. That's good enough. Thank you. Let's pray together. Kneel down and pray together.